So thank you. Thank you for your patience while we do that.
Bienvenidos a Resistir el Colonialismo de Asentimiento. Si desea escuchar este evento en español, haga clic en el botón en la parte inferior de la pantalla que dice Interpretación y seleccione Español. También recomendamos que haga clic en Silenciar audio original o Mute Original Audio para que solo escuche la interpretación en español y no el audio original en inglés. Si no ve el botón Interpretación, haga clic en el botón que dice More o Más, y la interpretación debería ser una de las opciones ahí. Si tiene problemas para conectarse al canal en español, háganoslo saber enviando una pregunta, haciendo clic en el botón Q y A, donde están las burbujas de conversación en la parte inferior de su pantalla.
If you would like to use the closed captioning feature, please click on the bottom button at the screen, the bottom of your screen, where it says closed captioning, and you should begin seeing the captions at the bottom of the screen. In addition, everyone should be able to see the American Sign Language interpreter currently and throughout the event. If you have trouble accessing closed captioning or any trouble seeing the ASL interpreter, please let us know by clicking on the Q&A button and writing us a question. If you have any other issues accessing the event, please let us know through the Q&A feature or by emailing us at rlsccolloquium2022@gmail.com, and we will do our best to assist you. We'd also like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded land of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie community, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. New York University and the Review of Law and Social Change also acknowledge that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples, including on those whose land this institution is located. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to the beginning of the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And now we'd like to introduce one of our editors-in-chief, Amelie Daigle, to give some opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Amelie Daigle, and I am one of the editors-in-chief of the NYU Review of Law and Social Change. I'm a white person with short brown hair and a black jacket. Tonight, I am honored to be here with our journal's Colloquium editors, Rachel Lindy, Camara Stokes-Hudson, and Rebecca Hutchinson. We would like to welcome you all to day one of Resisting Settler Colonialism, a two-part colloquium bringing together 20 organizers, legal practitioners, and activist scholars to confront the United States' role as a settler colonial society and explore the ways in which settler colonialism manifests itself in its laws, policies, and practices. Each year, the NYU Review of Law and Social Change, which is an academic journal founded during the Civil Rights Movement to support scholarship for social justice, hosts a colloquium on a complex and timely social justice topic, with the goal of centering conversations that have otherwise been on the fringes of legal academia. All too often, legal academia serves as an accomplice to settler colonialist states, but tonight we take this opportunity to elevate those voices in the legal field that challenge imperial hegemony and dare to imagine liberation. I am so deeply honored to share this moment of resistance with all of you. Before we get started, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our amazing colloquium organizers, again, Rachel, Rebecca, and Camara, as well as the dozen-plus staff editors who have worked tirelessly over the last 6 months to put this colloquium together. This event would not be possible without our partners, including BALSA, the Center on Race and Inequality, Color, DALSA, the Immigrant Rights Project, NLG, Outlaw, SALSA, the Suspension Representation Project, and the Woman of Color Collective, and with the support of more than 20 co-sponsoring student organizations, a complete list of which you can find in the brochure you should have received via email. This evening, we will hear from 2 amazing panels, each running approximately 90 minutes. You can find additional information on each panelist in our brochure. Each panel will leave time for questions at the end. We'd like to encourage you to send questions for the panelists by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, which makes things easier for our moderators. But if you are unable to use the Q&A feature, please send questions by email to rlsccolloquium2022 @gmail.com. If you are an attorney seeking continuing legal education credits in New York State, you must have registered with us in advance and logged into Zoom with the same email address you provided to us prior to joining this event. Panel moderators will periodically announce and display for approximately 30 seconds the CLE codes that you must write down and provide to us after the event in order to receive credit for attending. Each code will be read twice. And with that, we will turn things over to our opening panel, What is Settler Colonialism?, to set the stage with a discussion of the theory and history of settler colonialism, as well as how US law and culture maintains settler colonialism. This panel is moderated by Professor Natsu Taylor Saito. Professor Saito is a Regents professor at Georgia State University College of Law in Atlanta, where she teaches international law and international human rights, race, ethnicity, and the law, and professional responsibility. She is a faculty affiliate of Georgia State's Center for Access to Justice and its Department of African American Studies, and also is the Distinguished Senior Fellow with the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Natsu's scholarship focuses on questions of race, citizenship, and the rights of Indigenous peoples, national security and political repression, and international human rights remedies for race-based injustices. She's the author of several dozen law review articles, as well as 3 books, including Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law, Why Structural Racism Persists. And you can read Professor Saito's full bio in the Colloquium brochure. And now I am completely delighted to leave you all in the capable hands of Professor Saito. Turning it over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all. And thank you to the many, many people who put in so much effort to bring this event together for us. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and I'm Japanese American. I have long gray hair because I'm old, and it's really wonderful to see so many young people in really taking on these important issues. And I want to introduce to you our panelists by reading their bios. And I apologize in advance if I fail to get the pronunciations right, but I'm going to try. So one of our panelists is Avigail Aviles Tekashko, a community organizer with Undocu Mami Mutual Aid and Queens Neighborhood United. Avigail is a brown badass organizer from Corona, Queens. She comes from an immigrant working class family. Her family fled poverty from Chicotan, Mexico. And in this country, her family has been displaced multiple times due to landlord greed and lack of laws that protect tenants. Her lived experiences led her to get involved in organizing to create collective power in her community. For the last 6 years, Avigail has organized CUNY students, street vendors, tenants, faith leaders, and immigrant families against ICE raids, police abuse, and displacement. She is dedicated to uprooting the systems that seek to evict, abuse, and let her community die. Avigail is actively creating a world she wants to live in that centers human need through coordinating the Undocu Mami Mutual Aid Network. A second panelist is Noura Erakat, an associate professor at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. Noura Erakat is a human rights attorney, associate professor in Africana Studies and the program of criminal justice at Rutgers, and a non-resident fellow of the Religious Literacy Project at Harvard Divinity School. Noura is the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, from Stanford University Press 2019, which received the Palestine Book Award and the Bronze Medal for the Independent Publishers Book Award in Current Events Foreign Affairs. She's the co-founding editor of Jadalia, did I say that right? And editorial board member of the Journal of Palestine Studies. She has served as legal counsel for a congressional subcommittee in the U.S. House of Representatives, as legal advocate for the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights, and as a national organizer of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. Noura has also produced video documentaries, including Gaza in Context and Black Palestinian solidarity. She's appeared on CBS News, CNN, Fox News, and NPR, among others. Erika Pinheiro is another panelist, the Litigation and Policy Director of Otro, Lado. As Litigation and Policy Director of the Direct Legal Services nonprofit Otro, Lado, Erika Pinheiro leads her organization's efforts in filing class action lawsuits challenging the U.S. government's attacks on the U.S. asylum system, as well as slave labor practices and severe medical neglect in immigration detention facilities. Her team has reunified dozens of separated families, including parents who were deported without their children, and has freed dozens of asylum seekers detained at the border. Before joining Otro Lado, Pinheiro administered one of the largest DACA programs in California, as well as representation programs for unaccompanied children. She also oversaw high-volume legal orientation programs for adults and children detained in immigration prisons. And finally, we're very excited that Regan de Loggans could join us. Regan de Loggans is an indigiqueer agitator, art historian, curator, and educator based in Brooklyn on Canarsie land. Their work relates to decolonizing, indigenizing, and queering institutions and curatorial practices. They are a member of the Indigenous Kinship Collective, New York City. So thank you all so much for being here with us. And to get us started, we're just going to start with a very basic question that goes to the heart of this panel. And so we're asking each of you to share with us, what is settler colonialism from your perspective? And I'd like to add to that, why do we care, right? What does it do and how does that affect or impact your work? So do we have a volunteer?
I can start.
Great, thank you, Erika.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so honored to be on this panel with my co-panelists. You all are amazing. So at, just the basic theory, as I understand it, settler colonialism is different from like classic, regular colonialism in that the colonizers come to stay and create a new identity by displacing Indigenous people, by enslaving, displacing, exploiting Indigenous and Black people. And with this new identity, assert sovereignty that excludes those populations. And so it's, for me, like as an immigration practitioner, it's really bound up in the idea of the nation state. Like borders are sort of like, the lines that delineate these like settler colonial identities, and immigration law and the borders are used to really be a filtering mechanism. Who belongs, who doesn't, who has the rights of citizenship and who doesn't. And, in my just perception from working on the border, it's just seeing how Indigenous and Black migrants in particular are completely excluded and dispossessed of any of the rights and benefits of these identities and citizenship, even if they technically have citizenship. So, I mean, I'll stop there. I'm sure others have like more of a contribution, but it really matters to talk about this because I think the ideas of sovereignty and the nation state and citizenship and the right to exclude based on citizenship are rarely questioned. So we need to start questioning them if we are going to have any type of liberation for Indigenous and Black communities. So
I'd like to jump in.
Okay.
So Erika, in the spirit of offering a bit of a theoretical overview of what we know from, literature and such, I would just like to add that unlike in a case of colonialism, where the settler travels and leaves behind their sovereignty in the metropole and seeks to exploit the local population and extract those goods. In a settler colonial situation, the settler travels with their sovereignty to this new land where the territory is the central organizing principle of identity, as well as whatever political economy is about to be set up. In that way, yes, they come to remain and to replace, whereby citizenship, in my opinion, isn't necessarily, even if it was inclusive, wouldn't be sufficient, because those two sovereignties, settler sovereignty and indigenous sovereignty, remain incommensurate. Right? It's not as if they created a binational republic. They actually created a settler sovereign republic. On a personal level, as a Palestinian who's endured Zionist settler sovereignty, this has translated into being racially constructed as a threat, as a terrorist, as already always guilty. And that all facilitates something that's actually common to all settler colonial situations, which is a form of eliminatory violence, another structure that we are, as indigenous peoples, marked for elimination, either through outright removal, massacre, forced assimilation, and such. These are the things where, yesterday 3 young men were assassinated in Nablus, in bright daylight, under a framework of security, whereby that's not questioned. But the truth is that most Palestinian bodies are expendable in that way, right? We are expected to die. And so here you also get racial theories that interact with these settler colonial theories. The last thing that I'll say, why is this important for our work? Because it matters in what we struggle for, right? It's not that we are struggling necessarily for equality in the settler colony or for democratization of the settler colony, but we are struggling for decolonization of the settler colony. And in the case for Palestinians, that means the de-Zionization, right? Dismantling Zionism and the settler colonial processes that are associated with it, as well as the apartheid structure that I, in my opinion, believe is an outcome of the settler colonial project, as well as the legal model to consolidate the territorial takings.
Thank you. These are great, basic concepts that are coming out here. And I especially appreciate the focus on, interrogating the state and on thinking about what decolonization means in terms of our work, because I think that's the place at which it's so hard often to make the transition from equality focused struggles to actual challenging of settler colonial framings. Avigail, did you want to go next? And then Regan, we're going to wrap up with you. Is that okay? All right, you get the final word on this one.
Yeah, and I think both of the panelists have talked about this briefly, right, or touched on it, that it's also allowed or even justified, right, to harm Indigenous and Black people, because there's this heightened sense of morality, with the colonizer, right? They create these wrongs and rights, and the Indigenous and the Black person is always in the wrong, right? They're always immoral, right? And then they need to be saved, or they need to be colonized in order to be brought up to the modern day, right? So we see that in historical displacement and even present day displacement, right? They deserve to be displaced, right? That's the mentality of the colonizer. So that's also an important thing, right? Because if they are bad, then you can justify anything that's done to them. And that's why so much harm is caused, right, to Black, brown, queer people.
Thank you. Regan.
Yeah, well, first I wanted to kind of answer the question of what is settler colonialism? And often when I'm asked this question, I have to compare it to regular colonialism, because it's the easiest way for people to kind of understand what the dynamic is, which is regular colonialism is they come, they eat, they leave. They come to our land, they resource extract, and then they get the hell out. And they usually have caused an immense amount of damage. And we've seen the colonialist narrative really particularly disturbing in places like Africa and Southeast Asia, where the British Empire comes in, fucks shit up and then gets out. And that's the intention of colonialism. Now, how does that differ from settler colonialism? The intention is they come, they eat, and they never leave. It's part of the practice to take the land. It's part of the practice. The land is the resource, and it must be extracted by any means necessary, which includes the removal of Indigenous people off of our lands, the destruction of our lands, and also the unjust enslavement of Black folks
as means and modes of labor. And I do want to note that, I think it's important that we are having a conversation about settler colonialism, but there's no Black people on this panel. And I think that in the future, we need to be more thoughtful in terms of what the intersections look like, because we cannot be sitting here talking about settler colonialism without having Black voices at the table. That just doesn't make sense. And there's actually a pretty big oversight. And as an Indigenous person who comes from Southeastern tribal communities, it's imperative to uplift Black narratives as many of our communities are intertwined as Afro-Indigenous people or as Black Indigenous people. But I just want to note that I think that that's something already that is concerning in terms of having conversations about settler colonialism and not including Black voices at the pinnacle, at the paramount of that definition. But yeah, the intention of settler colonialism is resource extraction. And unfortunately, the mythos of a benign American history is largely based on this idea that immigration was neutral. People came here to seek religious freedom, when the reality is white settlers came here knowing that Indigenous populations existed and participated in the massive genocide of our population.
Thank you, and thank you for that really important acknowledgement of how we really can't separate this conversation out from the experiences of people of African descent in this continent as well. That's really critical, I think. There's lots of questions we can get to, and I have some specific individual questions, but in terms of sort of a question for everybody, could you give us some contemporary examples that you encounter, either not necessarily personally, but in your work or those you work with, that really illustrate the problems that are caused by settler colonial occupation? And I'm asking that in a way to try to get to the notion, or to illustrate why people might concretely find a settler colonial lens to be helpful in understanding the injustices that they see around them. So I'm hoping that maybe each of you could give us one or two examples that you encounter in your work, because I know you're all working with respect to righting injustices in some form or another. But what is it about settler colonialism that's peculiar to creating the problems that you are dealing with? So maybe we'll mix it up. Avigail, you want to start?
Yeah, I was planning on talking. So what I wanted to bring up when you asked that question is that, right, so I can speak to the present day version of settler colonialism, right? In specifically here in Queens. So we saw a couple years ago, right, when Amazon announced that they wanted to locate their second headquarters here in Queens, it would have displaced a public school. It would have been right next to the largest public housing in the country. And we had to organize against it, right? Because these are the communities that we had made a home in, right? If you think of Queens, right? It's truly there's people from every corner of the world, almost every language is spoken here. And this is where we have decided to make our home, right? We were forcibly displaced from our countries, from our lands, and we came to Queens. This is where we brought our families. This is where we expanded. This is where we've grown. And we have to continue to constantly fight for it, right? We organized heavily to get Amazon to pull out of the plans, and they did. But even then, right? Today and age, right? We still see the large amount of displacement. Even right now in New York State, 200,000 families are at risk of displacement and eviction, and that's legal, right? Legal evictions are happening. So again, that goes, and people, I'm a housing organizer, right? So to me, that sounds catastrophic. But then, you can talk to the average day person, and it doesn't seem that way. And why? Because the settler colonialism, again, has enacted or instilled in us that, well, these people who are being evicted, they deserved it, right? There's this sense of they don't deserve housing, they don't deserve, they don't have a right to this home. And it's obviously wrong, right? Because again, again, right, there's a large conversation on landlords, right? And the way they're profiting off of land that's not theirs. and like extracting our wealth, the wealth that we the wealth that we produce through our labor. They're stealing that, right, in the form of rent. So that's how it's playing out in the present day, right? Like families will be forcibly removed from their homes. 200,000 of them, more than that, are at risk of a marshal coming, banging on their door and forcing them out of their homes. And that is settler colonialism in the present day, right? People are being forcibly removed from the places that they call home in order to bring in, right, wealthier or better residents.
Okay. Who wants to go? Erika, you want to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think of one example. I feel like my entire job is just witnessing displacement. I mean, I'm in Tijuana right now. I wanted to say just talk a few seconds about like my personal background, because I think it will kind of inform, like, let you guys know kind of my perspective. So like my parents are both Portuguese, which, they're like the OG colonizers. So we grew up with this idea of like, I forget who mentioned it earlier, but colonization as like a you're like a bettering of the societies that you're colonizing, or colonizers as heroic, right? And like that messaging is like really like pushed into us as like from the time we're children. And then coming to the United States, like I really bought into the whole like nation of immigrants, and like I'm an immigrant. I grew up working class immigrant, so like I thought I was like everyone else. And it wasn't until I've worked in the immigration field for 20 years. I've worked in ICE prisons, in county jails, whatever, like criminal court, probate court, like working with kids who are being removed from their homes. And it didn't take me long to realize that like they weren't talking about me when they're, these laws do not apply to me as a person who's, of European descent. Every single person I saw in court, in jail, and stuck on the border is Indigenous or Black, right? So it's like, even within the United States, it's important to recognize how the project of genocide and enslavement is ongoing. It didn't stop with like regular colonialism. It's ongoing with settler colonialism. And I will give, the example of like, slavery is illegal except as punishment for a crime, right? So that's one piece of it. Family separation is like endemic in our criminal justice and immigration system. Like this is all ongoing. And when you see what's happening at the border and who it affects, it's like all of the resource and labor extraction that happened under classic colonialism is ongoing. The only difference is like, old-fashioned colonialism has gone out of style. We see it as morally wrong, whereas these concepts, neutral concepts of citizenship and sovereignty, absolve people who benefit from the settler colonial identity from like any kind of responsibility for what's happening right now. So, I mean, I would argue that the entire American project is an example of settler colonialism. The border and all the immigration laws and our criminal laws are like the tools to carry it out. And so, yeah, and just the last thing I'll say, like, as an American living in Mexico, like that's a whole other level of it, right? Like all the Americans around me, we're all gentrifying Mexico right now, okay? And like the white privilege that I have here is like amplified by my US citizenship, even though I'm not in the United States. So it's also important not to think about settler colonialism as stopping at a border. This is like a global system of apartheid in which there are people who benefit and people who don't, people who have freedom of movement and people who don't. So I think having that global context is also really important.
That's great. Thank you. Regan, are you willing to go next? And then we'll
Yeah,
come back to
absolutely.
Noura.
Yeah, I definitely, there's, this is such an excellent panel already, because I'm like writing notes vigorously so that I can be in conversation with y'all, which is always like really, really exciting. I think that's something people don't understand, is that settler colonialism is ongoing. We live in a settler colonial state. If you, like as of like right now, as an Indigenous person, you are currently occupying my land. So like that is just the basic of it. And I think that's something that people don't understand, is this idea that settler colonialism has ended. That's not reality. I live in Lenape-Hoking, which is, you know, so-called New York City, the epicenter of global capitalism, the epicenter of this other mythos of a, you know, a city of immigrants or a nation of immigrants, which is, you know, a complete garbage rhetoric and propaganda put together by JFK. You know, Google it. And the reason I bring it up is because it's imperative that people understand that Indigenous people are currently being removed off of our land. We are like in the United States, like not, you know, and of course, like I don't want to ignore the fact that we're talking about borders, because borders are colonial constructs, and they are, you know, insidious, disgusting, violent scars that should not exist and are not in they do not rely on Indigenous protocol. In fact, they are against it. So I just think that's something that folks don't understand, is that old-fashioned colonialism isn't gone, it exists. And we as Indigenous people have to constantly reckon with it. But, you know, I wake up every day on occupied land. I think that something that people, especially settlers, don't understand is that this never ended for us. It's still ongoing. Indigenous people are the most disproportionately affected by all sorts of systemic violences. Like that conversation, we cannot divorce one from the other. It's something that I talk about quite intensively, because as a historian, something that I even was taught when I was in school, in grad school, was that, you know, colonialism has somehow ended. Settler colonialism has somehow ended. But I remind you that national parks are an excellent example of the continuation of settler colonialism. They are held in trust away from Indigenous people. Those are our lands. They are not for white people to go play Indian and go camping. Like that is actually our space that is being withheld from us. You know, like that's one example of ongoing settler colonial project. And then as an Indigenous person from the US and from Central America, I also cannot ignore what settler colonialism looks like outside of these borders. And, you know, I advocate extremely for the liberation of Palestine. I am an anti-Zionist Jew myself, and it's an imperative conversation that we talk about, what does Indigenous solidarity look like from Turtle Island to Palestine? You know, what does Indigenous solidarity look like from here to Mexico, all the way to the tip of Condor? Like, what does it look like to be in these larger conversations? And if we were more intimately interconnected, we could, you know, we could unite in the forefront and say that settler colonialism is happening now. We see it every day. It did not stop in 1492. It has not stopped in 2022.
Great, thank you. You just reminded me of a speech. I won't have the quote exactly right, but a speech that Russell Means gave at one point, in which he talked about the Palestinians of North America sending their greetings and acting in solidarity with the Indians of Palestine. And I think that that's just a sentiment that has always stuck with me.
Well, the Zionist state is less than 100 years old. I know what colonialism looks like 500 years out. You know, like, how could I not advocate for the destruction of the settler state when I know what it looks like 500 years out?
So that's a nice segue to Noura.
Yo, I have goosebumps. The solidarity and resistance is joyful. So is struggle. I'm going to answer this question in two ways. Firstly and foremostly, as somebody on occupied territory, I teach a class on race, international law, and empire, where I teach students basically how international law, through its, as it facilitated the expansion of empire, created a global racialized hierarchy, right? So in that, we want to disrupt this doctrinal understanding of international laws, this lofty body of law, in order to understand what are its imperial roots and its ongoing legacies that we see very vividly today. In the discussion yesterday was actually on US Supreme Court jurisprudence, specifically 19th century jurisprudence, Johnson versus McIntosh, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and so on and so forth. And in the introduction of that class, I, as a Palestinian who is displaced, who has been marked for removal, right, by Zionist settler colonialism and Zionist settler sovereignty, I'm now a threat because of my existence. I identify as a settler here on these lands, on Piscataway lands. Now that might fall hard on some ears because I'm an Indigenous person myself. I have no intent to settle. I have no white ancestry, right? There's no European ancestry. And yet, by a matter of structure, as was stated by Regan, I actually don't make the distinction of the intent or lack of intent by virtue of being here structurally, living under American settler sovereignty. I am a settler vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples. What does that mean for me in terms of my responsibilities and my duties here? And so in that, I want to emphasize what you all are saying about the, the point that settler colonialism is not an event. It's not this one moment that happened that disappeared an entire people and turned them into Mickey Mouse characters, but it is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process of removal. It's in the process of dehumanization that we see, for example, in the creation of the transformation of Indigenous identity into mascots, is a process of dehumanization that actually trains us to accept the death and the elimination of Native peoples, right? It's the not understanding that there are outstanding violations of hundreds of treaties with Indigenous people, including the Treaty of Laramie and the demand for the return of the Black Hills. Again, emphasizing that this is not about compensation. This is not about some money, process. This is not about citizenship. This is not about equality. This is about a way of life and a connectedness to land that is at odds with a settler cosmology, right? And so this identity for me isn't some, it's not a performance. It's actually commitment, right? It's commitment that I do believe the land should go back. We have many recent examples of land being returned, and we can continue that in the advocacy, right? As a Palestinian, I'll just say this, two things. One, Palestinians who immigrate to the United States are not automatically, I do not think, are not automatically on the right side of history by virtue of our own suffering and oppression and resistance, but actually have a choice to make on which side of the color line we stand here on these lands, and which side of, in terms of the struggle and commitment to decolonization, where we stand on these questions. Our identity doesn't decide those things for us. Those are political questions and political answers. And oftentimes that politicization is produced through solidarity, not preceding it, right? And so the struggle actually is the fertile grounds for it. What does it mean for settler colonization? Natsu, you asked this question about what does it mean today? It's my entire life. It's my entire life. I'm still struggling with my family to get my cousin's body retrieved from a refrigerator at Tel Aviv University because he was shot and killed and called a terrorist, and we're not afforded a burial for him, right? It's the fact that when I say I'm Palestinian, I'm accused of anti-Semitism because there's been a movement to collapse anti-Semitism, right, and anti-Zionism. Two completely different concepts, which is through politics, which has been a political project to collapse those two concepts. So either I have to accept, in order not to be an anti-Semite under these terms, I either have to accept my non-existence, right? I have to accept mine and my people's obliteration, or the only other choice that they give me is to be an anti-Semite. This is the framework that's been set up as a result of politics, and it's what drives us in this panel, in the work that we do in knowledge production, in the organizing work, to lift these things up so that we can reject these binaries, and we can reject these false notions in the way that we collapse these two concepts in order to, in fact, create a world where all of our existence is actually mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive.
Okay, before we move on, does anybody have feedback or comments on? There's so much wonderful, rich, provocative material being put out here. Anybody want to say anything in response?
I do want to add, I want to note this conversation about collapsing anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as if they are synonymous is part of the settler colonial project. Like, that is its intention. It's like so very clear, because settler colonialism, what it does is it flattens identity and it flattens experiences to make them more palatable for propaganda, for dehumanization, for representation politics, which is like the new fun thing. You know, like what the intention is to completely flatten our experiences, and then to villainize those who look and seek stagnation, who look and seek and embrace the complexities that we are as people. So I just want to, I think that's a really important note in terms of like talking about the settler colonial project contemporarily. The idea that being an anti-Semite is somehow synonymous to being an anti-Zionist, how detrimental that is, and how honestly how insidious, how disgustingly insidious.
Yeah, there's so much, like I said, there's so much richness here. I hope at the end of, anytime we go around, if anybody wants to jump in and respond or add on, please do, because we really want this to be a conversation, not just a series of vignettes necessarily. One of the really interesting questions that sort of evolves out of what y'all have just shared, for me anyway, is how we deal with countering specific concrete issues, problems, injustices, such as what Avigail was referencing about a community being displaced. Say, there are many very specific things that we get involved with, struggling for. And how do we do that, recognizing that we are in fact on occupied lands, that what we're doing to bring about further justice could be potentially, and I'm not saying this about the struggles you were referencing, Avigail, but sometimes trying to make things better, more humane, etc., can be seen as legitimizing the occupation, or sometimes, as I've put it before, struggling for our equal share of the colonial pie. And how do we balance those? How do we assess, is it the types of struggles that we're going to support, or is there, with any struggle, a way to approach it so that we're not reinforcing settler colonial domination, but actually helping an overall project of decolonization?
Yeah, I think every organizer is probably, can probably respond to that differently. Like I've done paid organizing right through like 501c3, and then I've done like grassroots and formal organizing. And what you find a lot in like the 501c3 space is that organizers, I'm sorry for the interpreter, what I'm trying to say is like nonprofit organizers. It's this like liberal mindset of get our people in politics, right? Like create better laws, as opposed to where the mindset I come from as an abolitionist, where I'm like, perhaps that's a temporary or a short-term goal, but what we should be organizing for on a long-term goal, or what should always be our final point, should always be land back, right? Like you cannot create better laws, or you cannot create a better society on occupied land, right? Like our goal should be getting land back, right? Like it shouldn't be getting more progressives in office, right? That should not be the goal, right? Like I'm not a believer in like electoral politics. I don't believe that anyone is going to save us besides ourselves. So like that's what perhaps like more organizers should take on, right? Like it's not about getting more, DSA elected members into government. The goal should be, right? Like, how do we abolish the state? How do we abolish the US government and return the land back and get reparations to descendants of people who were enslaved and are still enslaved through the carceral system?
And I'm curious if the rest of y'all address this, or maybe we'll come back to it, but whether you believe that things need to happen in that order, right? Do we have to abolish the state first, in order to do these things, or are there ways of doing these things that will lead to a different form of state or non-state evolving? I'm just curious, but
I'll be happy to
great.
jump in here.
Great.
Okay, so incrementalism as a theory in harm reduction is a part of the settler colonial fantasy. That is just how they work. This idea that if we play into settler colonial politics, that somehow we will find freedom is a joke. And people who participate in that kind of narrative, I arguably will say, are disillusioned. I also do not support settler colonial, I do not support the electoral policy systems. I do not vote. I see no intention in voting when there's nothing that comes from it that provides any sort of service to people. In fact, it just placates and continues to uphold settler colonialism. So I think it's really disturbing when people tell me that representation in politics will somehow lead to a better life. When we see time and time and time again that no matter how radical a person is when they're voted into office, they are just there to uphold the state. Like that is their literal job. You know, they work for the state and not for the people. And I don't need, and I personally don't need a politician working for me. I've got my community that throws down in a way that they could never imagine. So I think this idea of like incrementalism and harm reduction is purposeful and strategic so that people don't go burn down everything right now. And there is no answer to settler colonialism other than the destruction of the settler state. There will be no freedom. There is no freedom to be had. There will be no Black or Indigenous liberation without the destruction of the settler state. And I don't believe that there's any way to navigate or participate in a way that serves anyone beyond the settler colonial narrative. So you know, I know that that's probably. No, actually, I don't know if that's even a hot topic at this point. I feel like everyone's really come into their radicality, or at least I hope people have come into their radicality. But I just want to commend Avigail. You're absolutely right. Like there is no justice without the complete destruction of these systems. The absolute obliteration of the settler state, the obliteration of the United States of America as we know it. That is the only way that we can ever have justice for Black and Indigenous people.
And at the same time, we think that it's important, don't we, for Avigail to be organizing this community to make sure that Amazon doesn't come in and displace them all. Right?
Of course, but those are not part and parcel. They're in collaboration. Because actually, another thing is the destruction of settler colonialism means the destruction of capitalism. They work together because it's all based in resource extraction. So I think that, you know, getting Amazon to leave with a tail between their legs is part of the narrative.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. Let's see, Erika, did you have a?
Yeah, I wanted to just talk about the harm reduction piece because, well, two things. Like, as an attorney, I feel that as a nonprofit attorney, let me do that. As a nonprofit attorney, I feel that we are forced into the role of legitimizing systems of oppression. Like even representing someone in court, you are helping someone navigate a system of oppression. And I will give the example of asylum. Asylum is fundamentally racist. Like you are forcing Black and Indigenous people to relive the most traumatic parts of their life to prove that they deserve to be part of the settler colonial state. And we are legitimizing that. You know, and it's hard to get out of that framework, especially because of the way funding works in the nonprofit world. But also, I just wanted to speak a little bit about harm reduction, like, and the volume of suffering that we're seeing, especially at the border or in prisons, right? It's like people like are asking for help, and we're going from like emergency to emergency. You know, like where people are literally dying around us and we're trying to like get them to a hospital or get them food or whatever it is. Like it's intentional to where we do not have time to step back and question the larger structure or even like have the energy to fight against it because it's so exhausting to like just watch bodies being like ground by capitalism and the border all around you, and like literally watching babies die around you. I do feel it is intentional, and the way that the nonprofit space is structured and positioned, it's like we will never be able to get out of that, like that dynamic. We'll never. And just the last thing I'll say is also like, I think it's a mistake to look to people in my position as leaders, and those of you who are in law school, like if we should, I mean, for me personally, like we are here in service of the people who are being affected by settler colonialism, and we need to, you know, obviously just follow their lead. And sometimes that looks like harm reduction, and sometimes, you know, we're working toward broader abolition, but it's like, we're not going to make the decisions on how we get out of this, right? So it's, I don't know. I struggle with this a lot because I understand my position and that I'm legitimizing this and that I'm stuck in this harm reduction cycle. But at the same time, it's like, I'm not going to be the one to decide how we get out of it. And I'm also like responding to the needs of the community around me in a way. So I'm not trying to like justify it. I'm just saying like, that's how it is. And like people with resources are never going to get out of that cycle to like lead us toward liberation. It's just not going to happen from the nonprofit space, in my opinion.
Okay, and I need to give us a little break here and let everybody who is taking this for CLE credit know that the code is PLEAT5, all one word, capital P, lowercase LEAT, number 5. No spaces, PLEAT5. Okay, and I'm expecting, Noura, that you might have a comment.
I absolutely do, because I'm completely in, right? I'm in agreement with the sentiment, and yet at odds when it comes to the details of the sentiment, right? So Erika, first I wanna say, you as an attorney acknowledging that you are complicit in this system, I really appreciate that, but I'm not sure that any of us are not. The students who are at university are paying tuitions, are attending universities on stolen lands. I mean, I am at a university, I receive my paycheck from there, I'm outside of, right, a strictly a law firm, and yet, you know, constantly chasing the way to find where you can do the least harm, and yet it's almost inescapable. I think that Natsu, in your example of trying to think about the Amazon workers, it was similar, you know, trying to draw out the tensions and the contradictions that we all live in. How do we escape these contradictions? Is there a silver bullet for them, a way out, right? I think that that's something I continuously, every day, right? You ask yourself and trying to find a way out of this contradiction. One of the ways that I've resolved this for myself is to not need to have some sort of black letter, right, rule that defines it for me, but instead that I can take it on a case-by-case basis. So whereas on the one hand, I can see a lot of incremental reforms that are actually become liberal veneers, enhance the project, extend its longevity, extend its legitimacy, right? I see other things that I would still continue to support, even if it was just in the short term to ensure that people live, as does your work, Erika, in asylum seeking, right? Now, and then, you know, the other examples, I'm just thinking about the Palestinian context, for example, everything in the Palestinian context extends the legitimacy of Zionism. Something like in 2011, as a result of human rights pressure and advocacy pressure, the Israeli state increased the age of minority for Palestinian children from 16 to 18, which had been, you know, 16 before, basically trying them as adults before, in military courts, and then set up juvenile courts. Anyway, the whole thing satisfied the human rights community, but ended up exacerbating the problem. It just made it easier to lock up Palestinian children and to oppress them, right? So I do understand these contradictions. I just also think that it's not always the same. It's not always the same across the board. The other thing that I think we risk, and I risk this when I see, you know, young people that I interface with, is if I can't tell them, right, where to apply themselves, right? If you have to organize, whatever it is, be it we want to burn it all down, that even that process needs to be an organized process. I believe. I think that even, if you want to have something that, becomes a catalyst, I believe in the principle of armed resistance. I believe in these principles. I don't think, I would support them, but I just think that anything that we do needs to be organized. And for that reason, I'm not vehemently against progressives in office, not because they're going to save us. They're not going to save us. If anything, they're only there because of us, right? But I believe in it because I believe in cultural change, and I believe in cultural change and spiritual change across time. What are we going to do with all the settlers if they don't agree that they're settlers? How do we develop a consciousness or help them or agitate so they develop the consciousness that they are settlers, so that they participate in the process of decolonization? Unless alternatively, I believe that we can prevail in armed resistance. And history has shown me that whereas armed resistance is not to be dismissed, it's not necessarily the answer on its own. And that transformation happens through a broad array. Even folks who are making film are part of cultural change, right? That's not to say that, okay, I want to work and I think that racism is culture. No, but I do think that images matter, and who we think deserves to suffer, and who we think should be spared suffering, right? I think that matters. I think that organizing matters. I think that media matters. I think that politics matter. I think that alternative cooperatives that are being created in Jackson, Mississippi as alternative forms matter. I think that radical, consciousness matters. I think it all matters. We're all trying to figure it out. So when you ask, is there a chronological way? Honestly, Natsu, I don't have a blueprint. I don't have a plan. But that's why I wouldn't dismiss these tactics, because I think that they all feed into what I hope would be a moment of historic change, as was the case with the Arab uprisings that began in 2011. Nobody knew that the self-immolation of a young street vendor would catalyze revolution across the Arab world to overthrow these authoritarian regimes. Also, we're now in a moment of counter-revolution, which was to be expected. But this is the nature of history. So for me, all of this is just to say, I wouldn't preclude everything based on, a single rule. I think that we can take it, we have to assess it. It's space specific. It's like in your community, Regan, you said your community protects you far more than any other elected officials, right? It's going to be place specific. It's going to be time specific. It's historically contingent. It's materially contingent. And so I just, I'm trying to figure it out. And I happen to, always approach this with a lot more curiosity and nuance, and with time, less and less conviction that I actually that I know it all. Not know it all, know at all.
I'm reminded by some of this conversation of something I read, and again, I don't have it right in front of me, so I won't get it exactly right, but it was in a talk by Stokely Carmichael, who was later known as Kwame Ture, Black power advocate and activist, who recognized and was very clear about calling this out as a settler colonial state at a time when a lot of people were not using that terminology or did not have that understanding. And he made it very clear that settler colonial states cannot exist without being genocidal. He was just really direct and clear. But somebody asked him once about why he was involved in voting rights struggles in the South. And he had been arrested at that point like 14 times maybe for participating in voting rights in the movement to try to get voting rights for Black folks in the South. And he said, I don't even believe in voting, right? But some of y'all have said, right? Like, I don't think, I don't vote. I don't think it makes sense to vote. He said, but I'm willing to be part of this struggle and to get arrested for it because it is empowering to people. And again, he didn't use these exact words, but he said they are trying to tell these people, no, you are not allowed to do that. And people are standing up and saying, yes, right? If you're telling me I can't do it, I'm going to go and do it. And in order to support them and back them up, I'm willing to get beat up and go to jail because it is empowering people in this larger movement. And to me, that always struck me as really profound in terms of, judging things by whether they are empowering as opposed to whether they're changing sort of the system in some incremental way. Because I've always felt that it's that empowerment that is going to actually liberate us. But we only have a few minutes left before we open up to general Q&A, and I'm hoping that maybe you would each be willing to share, if you have one, a concrete example of something that might be seen as small, but that is important to you in your work or in your life, that people in the audience, including law students and lawyers, right, could take as maybe something inspiring, right? Something that you see as part of a process of decolonization that maybe they don't recognize as such. Anybody have any examples like that?
Yeah, Natsu. I'd like to talk about like mutual aid networks. While it's a term that became more popular throughout the pandemic, it's been a practice that Indigenous people have always practiced, right? We've always depended on our own communities, like Black and Brown people. We've always depended on the people immediate to us, like our family, our neighbors. It's not necessarily something that we had coined. But obviously, like again, like throughout the pandemic, it's been increasing, right? So I help coordinate a mutual aid network. It's called the Undocu Mami Mutual Aid Network. We support like migrant women in Queens, and again, right, like it talks back to that, right? Like it goes back to, well, what do we see in the system, right? Like we see the system and nonprofits, right? Like decide who is deserving, like who is good, like who is worthy of these resources. Whereas the mutual aid network, when we expand, we don't ask those questions, right? Like we don't ask what's your income, right? Like we don't ask, like tell me your trauma story, and then we will decide whether or not you are worthy of support. So I think mutual aid networks are very good. Are a good example of the way I personally in my life, I'm actively creating the world that I want to see, where it's like we're not deciding based on need or worthiness to support our community. And that's what we're doing, right? Like we're all supporting each other. It's mostly, like I said, like the group is mostly migrant women. I am a US citizen in, again, the settler colonial US. But this is the support that the women are providing for each other, right? Like with whatever they need, they are supporting each other, because again, like it's not about whether, right? Because again, like I come from a nonprofit space, so I know, and even right now, like I work for the government. So it's this constant theme or motif that comes up, right? It's like, well, do you deserve it? Well, have you worked hard enough, right? Because like these are questions that come up all the time before you can get connected to resources. What's your income? How many people in your family, right? Like whenever you want to access any benefit through a nonprofit or through the government, these questions are going to be asked, right? So like someone gets to decide whether or not you deserve to live another day. And that's inherently, right? Like inherently capitalist, inherently, right? Like it's inherently harmful and violent, right? So again, like this mutual aid network is creating, right? Creating the world that we want to see every day through the ways that we support each other. And then I would also ask for the attendees, right, to get connected with your local mutual aid network, get connected to your local eviction defense network, because again, that is modern day, like settler colonialism, right? Like one, that we're living on occupied land, and two, that the people who have been forcibly displaced from their homes are now living in Lenape land and are again being forcibly displaced through landlords, through judges, through marshals. So I would urge everyone who is attending to get connected to their local mutual aid network or their local eviction defense network.
Okay, thank you. We have been informed that this is a good time to turn over to live Q&A. So I'm sure everyone will also continue, hopefully, to work in other examples you might have as we do that. And let's see. I'm sorry, I'm trying to to the organizers. My Q&A document is not showing the questions. Let me see if we can do that again. Okay. I'm not seeing questions on the Q&A document that I've been given. Is there? Somebody help me with that. Okay. All right. While we're getting the questions, Noura is going to have to leave shortly. And so Noura, do you have any final words for us?
One, I wanted to echo what you were saying. I think that that was another lesson. Like when when you try to, there's a million things going on when you want to decide on campaigns, like what is it that you do? One thing that that helps me navigate that question is, regardless of the outcome, what will help us build power? Right? What will help us build power? How do we consolidate ourselves? What will help us educate our own ranks and bring them into consciousness and empower them to be better, right, organizers? What will help us build power amongst others? So that's a guiding principle. The other thing, just for the audience to be clear, because I think we threw around Zionism and anti-Semitism as if folks understood this. And so I just want to be real clear. Zionism is an ideology at essence that believes that Jews should have a homeland, right? Now I distinguish that's theoretical, that's on its, and that's different from the religion. So anti-Semitism is anti-Jewish bigotry that actually constructed Jews as a racial group, notwithstanding the religious affiliation, constructed them in Orientalist terms within Europe as inferior, as unworthy, ghettoized, excluded from many parts of European citizenship, right? And ultimately subject them to an annihilatory process that reflected what was already happening in the colonial geography in terms of racial violence and massacres and the genocidal violence against colonized peoples, right? So then what's the relationship between these two things? That Jews may seek to define themselves as a people. Some people might be completely against this as well. I don't. I think that all peoples are imagined, all communities are imagined communities, and that how they organize and see themselves. I object, however, to the extension and the insistence that that then Zionism is applied in Palestine, where another people already existed, and that now for Zionism to be a political reality, it necessitates literally the removal and the elimination of all Palestinians. It comes at our expense, right? So when I say I'm an anti-Zionist, I completely am opposed to the Zionist project in Palestine. I would be opposed to it anywhere where people exist and live, right? Marking those people for elimination and necessitating their annihilation. That's what Western civilization expects of Palestinians. You all should just disappear to make up for this historical, right, this canonical human rights violation in the Western civilizational framework. Palestinians must be the sacrificial lamb. That's what they ask of us. Now, but at the same time, I completely oppose anti-Semitism. And in fact, I think that the same, race-based frameworks that mark Jews for exclusion springs from white supremacist, colonial, frameworks that have marked the rest of us for similar fates. And so, in fact, I believe that my commitment to combat anti-Semitism goes hand in hand with my commitment to combat and to dismantle Zionism.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us tonight. We have exactly 20 minutes left. We have to end right on time. So let's we have quite a few questions. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to them all, but the first one says, this is a question for those of us working in racial justice organizations within the US. How do we organize and push organizations to integrate the settler colonialist conversation / narrative as part and parcel of programmatic work that moves beyond just US borders. Example, when we discuss policing and police violence in America, we fail to connect Israel and the deadly exchange, even though it is inextricably linked to the occupation of Black and Indigenous bodies in the US. I'm sorry that Noura has to leave us for this one, but is anybody else willing and able to answer this one? How to integrate the conversations with our work?
Something that we've done is to have forums with affected populations so that they are the ones actually setting strategy and deciding where resources are allocated within our organization. Because like we don't feel, with, I mentioned before, like US citizen privilege and whatever, all of those privileges, like we cannot make those decisions for the communities. And so I think that's one way to make sure that those conversations are happening, because people who are affected, people who you're trying to help, basically, they have the best like vision and understanding of how problems, first of all, need to be addressed, and like what the analytical lens should be, what they actually need, right? Because in a lot of, with the nonprofit space, it's like funders by and large decide what resources communities are going to get. We're always chasing funding based on funder priorities. But something that we've tried to do within our organization is just like have regular forums that are not just performative, where we're like, oh yeah, we got feedback and now we're going to do whatever we want. It's really like, these are the decisions that we need to be made. Like, what do you think we should do? How should we expand the resources? And over the past few years that we've started doing this, it's like dramatically changed the focus of our work. So I can say it's worked because it's stuff that like I wouldn't have thought of, and it's been powerful because when we explain that structure to funders, they're more likely to fund what the community is actually asking for, rather than us being in that dynamic where we're just like chasing funding for a certain project that might not necessarily help the community. So that's one kind of like concrete way.
Great, thanks. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? We good?
I don't hope for the nonprofit world. That's all I have to say.
Yeah,
Okay.
actually, I'll hop in on that. Okay, I'm reading over the question. I wasn't going to answer because I kept rereading it over and over again. And I think that for me, the reality is, because the only way to answer this is to advocate that you just do it. How do you organize? You just do it. You start making those connections, you start making those mistakes, you start getting in there, and like really, you also have to move with a sense of fearlessness, and also understand that you're going to upset people in whatever, and it doesn't matter what organization you're in, what institution you're in, you're going to upset people if you start talking about settler colonialism, because it asks people to reckon every day with the fact that they are settlers, so that they are unwelcome guests on Indigenous land. And that they participate in anti-Blackness every day. So I think that, in terms of like how can there start being program-based work in terms of like integrating settler colonialist conversations, start doing it, just start talking about settler colonialism at lunch, at your desk, at, wherever you may be, and also consider that and imagine a future free of those bindings and restrictions. And then I think that maybe you could better advocate in what it looks like to be an accomplice or an ally in terms of, abolishing the settler colonial state. I think in terms of how that reflects work that's done outside of the US, I am always so much of an advocate to also focus on what is happening also here, because as I said previously, settler colonialism in the US is ongoing. You are currently occupying Indigenous land right now in this moment. So, what does it look like to organize here on the ground as well for Indigenous sovereignty, for Black rights? Yes, it's reflective to a number of other conversations, like we were just talking about the Zionist state of Israel. And those conversations should not be divorced And also, how do you advocate here now on the ground for the people whose land you currently occupy?
Thank you. All right. Our second question is, could the panelists expand on citizenship and how the construction of this and other statuses factored into settler colonialism? Jump in.
I don't know, I was kind of expecting Erika to talk about that. But I think in general, like anything that acknowledges is the state, right? Like it legitimizes it, right? Like I said, I work in government, right? Like that legitimizes it, right? Like when you seek funding from nonprofits or like from, you know, from the different funders, right? Like, and you like even being classified, right? As, you know, right? Like I always say I come from Corona Queens, like that legitimizes the state, right? Like the US state, because to Indigenous people, this is not Corona Queens, right? To me, it's a Corona Queens, right? To me, that's my home, but that's not what Indigenous people call this land, right? So I think anything, it's almost like every action that we take legitimizes the US state.
And so does that mean that on it standing on its own, that message could be seen as discouraging or disempowering to the law students who are listening to us right now, or whomever else? Like what keeps it from being disempowering?
I mean, I don't want to empower settlers, right? Like,
no, but I mean us. How do we
right,
take that message and turn it into something that we can put towards a decolonizing end?
Again, right, like it's just, right, like there's so many different answers, right? Like, and that's not my question to answer, right? Like I'm not an Indigenous person to this land. Like I cannot answer like what is the right or wrong way to do it. I would pass it over to Regan. So like what are, right, like again, like I am a settler, right? Like that's something that I need to acknowledge. That's a mirror that I need to look at, and right, and so what I do as an organizer needs to be in conjunction with Indigenous people whose land I'm on. So I can't answer beyond that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I was going to give a very technical legal answer to that, but I wanted to hear from my co-panelists because I think Abigail's answer is correct. Like there's no way to recognize like citizenship without legitimizing the colonial settler state. And I just see the way it plays out in our laws and how citizenship is used as this like sorting mechanism, again, to create this, to further colonialism. Like it's used so that people who don't have citizenship are exploited. They don't have rights. They can be removed from land, like all of that, right? Even if you look at people who are citizens, the rights of citizenship are taken away by the state through the criminal justice system, et cetera. So I think people think about citizenship as a relatively neutral concept because like ostensibly people of different races have access to it, but like that's not true. And even if you do, you don't have the same rights as people who belong to like the dominant colonial settler culture. So I think that's an important thing to recognize. It's not neutral. It can never be neutral. And if we respect it, we are legitimizing the violence that it perpetuates.
Regan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, Abigail, I do want to say also that you're my hermana indígena, like you're also like, just because you're not from here doesn't mean that you're not Indigenous. So like, just know that like I see you.
No, but it is different, right? Like in the same
it is different.
Yeah, like
it is different, but
Noura, right, is Indigenous to Palestine. When she's on this specific land that has people who died for, like who were murdered for it, like there is like connotations to that, right? Like so even though like my family and my lineage, right, can like be traced back to Jicotlan, Puebla in Mexico, right? That's not where I am currently. I am not in Jicotlan, right? Like I am standing on, breathing on, living on, benefiting, right? Like again, I work for the government, so I'm getting a paycheck because people were murdered on this land and were displaced from this land. So
yeah, I think it's imperative for again, I just want to talk about this flattening of experiences. It's imperative that we do not remove the complexities that are the narratives, and that, I'm Indigenous to Central America and North America. Like I'm Guatemala as well. I'm a child of an immigrant. I'm an immigrant myself. I think it's imperative that we don't flatten this conversation. And the reason I say that is because, again, that's part of settler colonialism. I think that's something that we missed in talking and defining settler colonialism previously, was also talking about who are not settlers. And the reality is that those who have been impacted by US imperialism, who have been impacted by ongoing colonialism, who have escaped and found refuge in the US, I do not see as settlers in the same way that I do not see people who are the descendants of enslaved people as settlers. I do not see those who follow natural and normal immigration patterns from South and Central America over the so-called border into the US as, who are Indigenous or Black as settlers, because we cannot ignore the amount of colonialism that also exists in Central and South America, and colonizers that exist in Central and South America who try to navigate that narrative in a problematic manner. So I just think it's also important that we don't flatten the definition of settler, so that people who have come here because of imperialism caused by the settler state are no longer barred entry. Because then I think we start to have these weird conversations about what the border looks like, especially to the global south. What does the border look like to the global south when it's been so destroyed by colonialism? So I think that this is a bigger conversation in terms of that. But yeah, I do agree that citizenship, no matter what, is inherently a colonial construct. Advocating for citizenship is advocating for the settler state. I think it's difficult when we're talking about people who are seeking citizenship to avoid being, sent back to countries that were dismantled by imperialism. As I said, I'm also Guatemalan. My country was destroyed by a coup put in place by the CIA in the 1950s. It has destabilized our people, and it has led to the largest amount of migrants moving from Central America into the so-called US. So there are conversations to be had about what that looks like. In terms of the statement that you made previously, Natsu, in reference to empowering and de-empowering the students of this chat, I think it's important that maybe they reckon with their privileges and reckon with the fact that they are, I assume a number of these students are settlers and participating in the continued colonial narrative. And I think it's really imperative to hear what Avigail says when she says that she's not here to empower settlers. I'm not here to empower settlers. That is not the ask. In terms of something, this reminds me now of like what people can do that is helpful or useful in terms of advocating for settler colonialism. If you're white, leave. Like, it's really that simple. If you are a settler on these lands, you have every capability of leaving. And I'm waiting for people to start going. And I think that this pushes back on this conversation we were having previously about incrementalism as well, is that I think people are assuming that we have an elongated timeline to start to have these conversations about cultural change. We are 6 to 8 years away from climate catastrophe. We do not have time to play these games of placating neoliberalism, placating progressive politics. It is time now to act in solidarity with Black and Indigenous people, and that requires people to reckon with their privileges and realize that these institutions that exist will not hold you. The only thing that will hold you are land, waters, and people, and we're destroying all of those for capitalism.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so let's see. If we have one more question. A starting framework to navigate the layers of dispossession and disempowerment that have occurred over time in the US, Indigenous peoples, Black people, immigrants being displaced from elsewhere, low-income individuals moving into spaces they can afford. What happens when there are, quote, competing claims to the same places that so many call home? what could a decolonial and participatory just approach look like? So I think you've in part answered that question for us from your perspective, Regan. Anybody else want to add on to that? And then we'll come back to you if you have more to add, Regan.
Would you mind?
4 minutes left.
Yeah, would you mind pasting that in the chat? I feel like it was a very long question.
It was a long question. All right. Here we go. Thank you. Rebecca's posted it for us.
Yeah, I agree that white people should leave, honestly. Like, and I personally actively trying to do that because I don't, after sort of like realizing what's happening, like opening my eyes to all of this, I don't think there's an ethical way for me to be in the Americas, honestly. It just is like inherently exploitative. I honestly feel that way. And it's not quite that easy to leave, trust me. Like I'm trying really hard to get like passport from another country and leave, you know. It's easy for us to move to the global South. Like that's easy. They'll take us with open arms, but like it's easier for us like to go back to Europe or do whatever. But I agree with you. Like I think that needs to be part of it. I think it's going to be really, really difficult to get most people on board with that. And I don't think Europe wants a lot of the Americans back, which is like white Americans back, which is another challenge. But I think we need to be like real about what we're looking at. And if we're like, well, I think settler colonialism is bad, but I want to buy a house and like, benefit from living on this land and still have all this privilege, like that's not going to work. We need to like give up our privilege. Like that is part of it. And it's not easy, but it is absolutely necessary. And as far as like the rest of that question, like I'm definitely not the person to answer it, but I will say like, yeah, that I agree with you, Regan. And I think we should all start contemplating that, or at least like if we are, those people who don't have another place to go, like working or listening to Indigenous people who do have a claim, or Black, people who do have some more legitimate claim to the resources, and really just, follow what they say. But I don't think there is an ethical way for European Americans to stay here, honestly.
Okay, 2 minutes left. Does anybody have a very, very quick wrap-up comment you would like to leave our audience with?
Sure. I will say, if you're looking for feasible ways to reckon with your with being a settler colonialist, white people should not own land. White people should not own property. There's no reason for you to do so. It is not your land. It is not your property. That is number one. So I think that if you have access to land, you have access to property, relinquish control of that, understanding that you relinquishing control is not based out of white saviorism, but rather that it is your duty. It is your duty to advocate for Indigenous and Black people, and there is no black and white. It is very black and white, which is that you act in solidarity with us, which will make you uncomfortable. But we've been uncomfortable for 500 years. So
okay,
I think,
thank you. I'm sorry, but we're out of time.
No problem.
And that
I know we have to end at 6.
That seems like a very good note to wrap up what's been said on this panel so far. Thank you all very much for your participation. Thank you again to the organizers, and thank you all to the audience for being with us and for sending in your questions and comments. And we hope that you took some ideas from here with you, and that it's provoked you to think about things in a little bit of a new and different way.
Great. So thank you so much, Professor Saito, and to all of our wonderful panelists. Like, we're so incredibly grateful for all of the incredible depth that you brought to the conversation about settler colonialism. Our next panel will be beginning at 6:30. You're welcome to stay on the Zoom, or it'll be available at the same link. And so we're excited to have y'all there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
Hello, welcome back, everybody. My name is Rachel. I'm one of the Colloquia editors. I am a white person with brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a black velvet shirt. I'm sure I speak for everyone who was at the first panel. Thank you so much for attending. If you were there, it was such an incredible conversation, so generative, and I'm so excited to learn more. With this panel, which we will now turn to our second panel, Landlessness, Displacement, and Migration, where we will discuss the ways in which settler colonialism manifests in displacement and leads to exploitation of migrants. Remember, if you are an attorney seeking continuing legal education credit for this event, you must have registered with us in advance and must write down any CLE codes that the moderator announces and displays during the panel. This panel will be moderated by Azadeh Shahshahani, Legal and Advocacy Director with Project South. Azadeh has worked for a number of years in the US South to protect and defend immigrants and Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. She previously served as president of the National Lawyers Guild and as National Security/Immigrant Rights Project Director with the ACLU of Georgia. Azadeh serves on the advisory council of the American Association of Jurists and on the board of directors of Defending Rights and Dissent. Azadeh has served as a trial monitor in Turkey, an election monitor in Venezuela and Honduras, and as a member of the jury in people's tribunals on Mexico, the Philippines, and Brazil. She has also participated in international fact-finding delegations to post-revolutionary Tunisia and Egypt, as well as a delegation focused on the situation of Palestinian political prisoners. She's the author or editor of several human rights reports, including a 2017 report titled Imprisoned Justice Inside 2 Georgia Immigrant Detention Centers, as well as law review articles and book chapters focused on racial profiling, immigrant rights, and surveillance of Muslim Americans. Azadeh received her JD from the University of Michigan Law School, and she also has a master's in modern Middle Eastern and North African Studies from the University of Michigan. Take it away, Azadeh, and we will be pinning you all now too.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you so much, Rachel. And I wanted to thank all the students at NYU Law School for organizing this colloquium and for enabling us to have this really essential conversation. So I'm honored to be joined by our great panelists. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them, and then we can start the conversation. Haddy Gassama is Director of Policy and Advocacy at the UndocuBlack Network. She is the National Director of Policy and Advocacy, and she was also recently on loan with the We Are Home campaign as their Legislative Strategy Manager. Haddy is from the Gambia and immigrated to the US in 2000 with her family. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science, a master's in international affairs, and a Juris Doctor degree. Haddy is licensed to practice law in Washington, D.C., and she has years of experience in the fields of international human rights and immigration law and policy. She has previously worked at the National Immigrant Justice Center, where she advocated for policies that enhance congressional oversight on the immigration detention system. She also represented survivors of torture from sub-Saharan African countries in their asylum proceedings before US Citizenship and Immigration Services. When she's not doing advocacy work, Haddy is also an accomplished writer who has published several essays and articles on a range of topics, including gender equity, international politics, and pop culture. Morningstar Gali is project director at Restoring Justice for Indigenous Peoples. Morningstar Gali is a member of the Ajumawi band of the Pitt River tribe located in Northwestern California. She serves as project director for Restoring Justice for Indigenous Peoples and as the California Tribal and Community Liaison for the International Indian Treaty Council, working for the sovereignty and self-determination of Indigenous peoples and the recognition and protection of Indigenous rights, treaties, traditional cultures, and sacred lands. She is also the Tribal Water Policy Organizer for South California Salmon. Dedicated to raising awareness and visibility within the unique climate of California's urban and rural Native communities, Ms. Gali coordinates support of Indigenous-led organizing efforts. Ms. Gali continues to lead large-scale actions while coordinating Native cultural, spiritual, scholarly, and political gatherings throughout California. She is deeply committed to advocating for Indigenous sovereignty issues such as missing and murdered Indigenous women, climate justice, gender justice, and sacred sites protection on behalf of the tribal and intertribal communities in which she was raised. Prior to returning to her ancestral homelands and working for her tribe, she served as a volunteer and advocate on behalf of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated Indigenous peoples in California, working with a number of Indigenous-led grassroots organizations in the Bay Area for over 2 decades. Morning Star serves as a board member for the California Indian Heritage Center Foundation, American Indian Cultural District of San Francisco, and Women's Health Specialist of California. She serves on a number of advisory committees that advocate for the sovereignty and self-determination of California's Indigenous peoples and sacred landscapes. Catherine Perez is the executive director of the Coelho Center for Disability Law, Policy, and Innovation. Catherine is the inaugural director of the Coelho Center for Disability Law, Policy, and Innovation, and a visiting professor of law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles since 2018. She received the American Association for People with Disabilities HERN Leadership Award in 2017 for her work in founding the National Coalition for Latinx People with Disabilities. Catherine has a JD from UCLA Law School, and she's a PhD candidate in disability studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She sits on the board for Disability Rights California and Mental Health Advocacy Services. Catherine identifies as a disabled queer Latina whose grandparents migrated from Mexico in the 1960s. And Eve Tong Nguyen is an organizer with the Red Canary Song and Survived Unpunished New York. She's a queer and a disabled Viet cultural worker and sex worker whose organizing home is with Survived Unpunished New York, Red Canary Song, and Freedom All for Public Health. Eve is here representing Red Canary Song, a grassroots collective of Asian and migrant sex workers, centering base building with migrant workers through a labor rights framework and mutual aid. And the organization believes that decriminalization is necessary for labor organizing and anti-trafficking. So I would like to now ask the panelists to introduce their work and make opening a statement for about 5 minutes for each panelist, and whoever wants to start.
I can jump in, I guess, because I hate awkward silences. Hi, everyone. As Azadeh mentioned, my name is Haddy Gassama, and I serve as the Policy and Advocacy Director for the UndocuBlack network. And UndocuBlack is really a nationwide network of currently and formerly undocumented Black immigrants. And our work largely focuses on fighting against sort of the intentional and willful erasure of the experiences of Black migrants within like the larger national, even sometimes international conversations around immigration.
We focus on the intersection of immigrants' rights work, human rights work, as well as just a general fight against anti-Blackness and white supremacy that is so endemic in this country. We do that a various number of ways. We focus on federal policy and fighting to make sure that any policy that is passed either from the executive branch or through the legislative branch really incorporates and is equitable to the needs of Black migrants. We have an amazing media and narrative team that is dedicated to continuing, like so many of our normal traditions of storytelling, where we center the experiences of Black migrants without re-traumatizing members of our community, without exploiting members of our community or doing it in an extractive nature. And we also have an amazing community wellness and community engagement team that is really hands-on with making sure that we as Black migrants not only exist and survive, but really thrive. We know we can't do any of the fighting and organizing that we want to do unless we ourselves are good within. And so we have like a strong wellness program, which also focuses not only on physical wellness, but also mental health. And I will leave it there. Really grateful to be here and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Any of the other panelists would like to jump in?
Hi, I can jump in. This is Eve speaking. Thank you so much for that introduction today, and I'm very honored to be on this panel with all of you. I am first and foremost a PIC abolitionist and sex worker organizer in New York City, also known as Lenape-Hoking, and I think that I would be remiss in not doing a land acknowledgement and also wanting to push forward the Indigenous folks here in Lenape land. The Lenape people very recently have requested to have a land acknowledgement honorarium given to them as they have purchased back 50 acres of land and are continuing to purchase land back, as well as like cultivating that land. So I'm going to drop a link to their PayPal in the chat for everyone who is attending here. Before this panel, I donated $50. I would advocate for everybody to either match or exceed that amount if they can. And so here on this panel, I'm mainly talking about my work with Red Canary Song, which is an Asian sex worker and migrant massage worker organizing group here in New York City. And we partially also work to re-articulate the position of the migrant rights movement as a struggle against settler colonialism, as we all do criminalized labor and are working against different sorts of forces, whether that be white supremacy, imperialism, and colonization, in trying to establish rights for ourselves and for other workers as well. And we also do that through the lens of not only the migrants' right movement and labor rights movement, but also in prison industrial complex abolition. And again, thank you so much for having me on this panel. And I'm very thankful for your dedication to language justice by having interpreters here.
I can go. Hi, I'm Catherine Perez, and I am, like Azadeh said, queer, disabled Latina. I have light skin and long brown hair that's pulled back. I wear light glasses and I'm wearing a black button-down shirt. And I have been on a journey with the disability rights and disability justice communities over my professional life. I grew up with lived experience of disability, but didn't know about or really even identify as disabled. I grew up with psychiatric disability, and my little sister has intellectual disability and is autistic. So I grew up in a community, a family community of people with disabilities. But it wasn't until I went to law school that I really learned about and found out about the disability rights movement. And although I had always committed myself to disability justice, that took more definitive shape. So since then, I've entered academic sphere. When we started the National Coalition for Latinxes with Disabilities, I did a little bit of grassroots work for 4 years. It was during the Trump administration. So although we were working at the intersection of Latinidad and disability, we focused a lot of our efforts on immigration and disability justice issues. More currently, as Azadeh said, I'm the executive director of the Qualo Center. So I'm at a nonprofit at a law school and I teach disability rights law. So I am more of an academic, policy wonk. But in these spaces, I still try to disrupt. Right now, we are putting together a disability and immigration conference workshop for both disability rights and disability justice activists and immigration justice activists to be trained on both sides and how they intersect, and that's coming up. It'll be 3 consecutive Fridays starting on April 29th, so I'm really excited about that. So that's just one of the ways that I'm able to use my current job as director of the Qualo Center to co-sponsor these type of events. Yeah, I write a little bit of academic work as well. But otherwise, I'm incredibly honored to be among this esteemed panel, and I feel like I'm going to learn a lot more probably than I can offer. So thank you for having me.
Shimisanui, my name is Morningstar Gali. I said hello and greetings in my language of Ajumawi. I am a member of the Ajumawi band of the Pit River tribe, located in northeastern California, up by Mount Shasta. I am wearing some white dentalium shell earrings and a black sweater, and I have mid-length brown hair and brown skin, and I also have braces on. I am very honored to be here on this panel today with the rest of the panelists. I am here currently on occupied Nisenan, Miwok, and Maidu territories, and so paying respect to our relatives. I serve as the project director for Restoring Justice for Indigenous People. Learn more about RJIP at our website, indigenousjustice.org. I can share the link for everyone, and also serve as the California Tribal and Community Liaison for the International Indian Treaty Council. I have worked for the IITC since 2008. It is a part of the International Indian Treaty Council is known as the international arm of the American Indian Movement. I was born in the AIM House, what was known as the AIM for Freedom Survival School in the late 1970s. And so have spent my life dedicated to the issues of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights. I appreciate the land acknowledgement and the information about the land tax, and also do want to share that it goes beyond a land acknowledgement, that we are living Native peoples that are still here, still existing, still fighting for the protection of our sacred lands and waters, and still very much fighting against resource extraction, colonialism, settler colonialism in all of the forms. And so I look forward to the continued conversation with all of you. And again, thank you, Sisulai, for having me.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. So I wanted to move forward to asking some questions addressed to all members of the panel. And so whoever wants to answer any of them, please go ahead. So the first question is colonialism just about land?
So I'll answer that colonialism is not just about land, that colonialism in all of its forms is to eradicate us as Indigenous peoples. And so as Indigenous peoples throughout North, Central, and the South Americas is what we have experienced here. Where I currently live in California, we have over 200 tribes throughout California, and most people aren't aware of that. We have 110 tribes that are considered federally recognized. And so there is this rubric that's been created by the US settler state of what defines who is a Native person by how it is that you can prove your lineage and prove your descendancy. And so it's the US government that has created this system to, on paper, who is it that can decide that they are a Native person. And so my tribe is federally recognized, but the tribes in our surrounding region are not. You'll find in many metropolitan areas, such as the Bay Area, which is known as the Ohlone Bay, the LA metropolitan area, which is largely Tongva territories and Tataviam, and also here in the Sacramento Valley area, that many tribes, there's between 50 to 70 that have not been afforded federal recognition. And it's absolutely due to, when you compare real estate costs, these are areas that are considered prime real estate all along the coast of California. Many of these tribes, the majority of these tribes are not afforded federal recognition status because that would mean having to provide just as with our Lenape relatives that had to repurchase their ancestral territories, there would have to be a visibility and land for the existing tribal members.
Thank you so much. Anybody else want to add that question?
I can go. I think speaking from the perspective of colonialism in the African context in particular, it's just as Morningstar stated, it's so much more than land. I think it at its core is either, about exploitation and in some senses eradicating a sense of who the Indigenous and Native people of, these places are. I think of my own family history where, we're a tribal people and I have family, I'm from the Gambia, which is just a tiny strip of land inside of Senegal, which again goes to how ridiculous the concept of borders are and how arbitrarily, they're drawn. And I have family on both sides of that border, but I also think of it within the context of my work in immigration, where so many of the folks that we see who are displaced, who have to leave their home countries to immigrate to the US, oftentimes are done so through forces of either direct colonialism or remnants of colonialism or newer versions of it in the forms of imperialism. I think of Cameroon, for example, where currently we are fighting to have temporary protected status given to Cameroonian people who are in the States because the country has, I believe, more than 3 different armed conflicts going on at the same time. At the root of many of those conflicts is this, strife between the Francophone people and the Anglophone people. So the region of the country that was formerly dominated by the French and then formerly dominated by the British, and then, smushed people together in, what is a make-believe country or with make-believe borders. And, there have been nonstop violence since then. And so you think of it from both sides where there's the frustration that people are killing each other as a result of colonialism and who colonized them and, the languages that they speak as a result of that. But then you also see the cruelty of the US immigration system against those people who are fleeing that violence. And we on a day-to-day basis see the horrors of immigration detention centers and things of that nature. So I would definitely agree with Morningstar that it goes far, far, far beyond just land.
So Haddy actually got us started on the next question. So in panel 1, there was a discussion about the relationship between borders and settler colonialism broadly. Could you all describe from your experiences or work how you've seen this relationship manifest and its impact?
Sure, I can go first. This is Eve speaking. I mean, in terms of borders and settler colonialism, to even be able to have borders underlies a logic in which that people could own land and it could be propertized, and Indigenous activists have spoken against this for many, many, many years now. And that is a degree of violence that exists and continues to perpetuate settler colonialism. And even now, I mentioned about re-articulating migrants' right movements as a struggle against settler colonialism, because often a lot of movement work that exists re-entrenches ideas of borders and provides them with further legitimacy, which furthers settler colonialism, which also furthers to dispossess Indigenous people here in the US, right? We often have a lot of movement that talks about legal citizenship or the ways in which people are supposed to enter the country or be, which further legitimizes the violence that borders puts onto us and legitimizes them as a place that could exist, and that even as migrants or immigrants sort of assumes that when you leave someplace that you are not meant to be there, that you're not of that land, that you are separate that, and only furthers settler colonialism as well, and continues to dispossess people that still exist and happens overseas as well in a transnational context and along lines with imperialism as well. And I think that Haddy addressed some of this, that the sorts of violence that borders have imposed through colonialism exist globally.
Anyone else would like to address this question?
Sure, I'll just add in, it's just always really interesting just in terms of what I was speaking to earlier about our tribes in California and how they have been and have not been afforded federal recognition, that we also see how this plays out across borders and across territories, right? And so we see how, there is this kind of acceptance and understanding that even throughout our tribal communities, that tribes in throughout Canada, and of course with Alaska, I have a relative that is joining from Alaska, so hello to her, but that our relatives, that somehow there is a separation between our northern Indigenous relatives and our southern Indigenous relatives. And so we see that as I've traveled throughout Mexico and Panama areas, and that anywhere that you go in the world, that Indigenous peoples are self-defined, but that here in the US, that it's Native peoples, dogs and horses that need that paper classification for the definition of who they are as Native peoples, and have to provide that proof. And so just providing that our borders have split our tribes throughout California, throughout Arizona, throughout Texas, and all of the southern regions. And we recognize that, and recognize that these are our relatives, that it is us very much, that our creation stories go back to time immemorial, but even our carbon dating for our sacred places goes back anywhere from 14 to 20,000 years, yet we are always having to continuously prove who we are and that we exist and that we have a right to continue to occupy the sacred lands that we're on.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can move to the next question, which is, what role does surveillance play in the settler colonialist project?
I can go. This is Eve speaking again. Surveillance plays a really large role, especially now. As the surveillance state continuously grows, we are continuing to see it grow. I'll pause for a second to let the interpreter switch. As it continues to grow and is largely now in the US, we're seeing that the surveillance state is extending to police borders here in the US, which a lot of that technology was developed via militarization and for imperialist projects overseas, which of course we also know is also settler colonialism is also a part of imperialism. And so the way that the surveillance state works now is like surveilling people and having people put in a place of even further state illegalization, which for me in my personal work has a lot to do with the way that migrant workers and sex workers navigate, because largely sex workers and migrant workers are surveilled throughout their daily life all of the time because of criminalization. And so these are all intertwined, and the way that the surveillance state interacts with people's daily lives has a lot to do with this and has a lot to do with this sort of settler, colonial, and imperialist projects at hand. To be able to surveil people in this way and to view people as being separate and trying to see who belongs of the state and doesn't, and who is criminalized and who isn't, is of course a part of it.
Is anybody else interested in addressing the issue of surveillance?
I'll just quickly add, this is Haddy speaking to so many of the wonderful points that Eve just made. Again, in the immigration context, we're dealing with it constantly, and it goes beyond like the militarization of the borders, but it's also even just how even so-called progressive sort of thinking around detention, for example, is framed. One of the more controversial conversations around immigration detention in particular is like this concept of alternatives to detention, which is of course ridiculous. There shouldn't be an alternative to detention. It should just all be abolished. But a lot of times what those so-called humane, and I'm doing air quotes, versions of alternatives to detention include are just really, really disturbing and egregious forms of surveillance. It looks like things like ankle monitors, or most recently, putting folks who are facing immigration enforcement into house arrest. Just this week, there was an Axios report that came out where the Biden administration, which promised to get rid of the use of private prisons to detain immigrants, is floating around this idea of an alternative to that should potentially be detaining people and confining them to their homes. And this of course would include things like certain surveillance mechanisms such as ankle monitors. So it's like this incessant need to continue to stifle the autonomy and agency of people, and to almost like entrap or like cage them wherever they are without the actual physical cages of jails and prisons. But like you could be walking down the street and there's all this CCTV and stuff that is entrapping and caging you. And now they're floating around this idea that if you are an immigrant and you potentially have some sort of deportation proceedings or something, rather than let you live in your community and thrive with loved ones, you could again be caged in your own house. So surveillance very much, just like all the other horrible things about colonialism and the immigration system, go hand in hand.
Thank you so much. And I would also like to add that Project South, my organization, which is a social justice organization based in Atlanta, working with grassroots movements in the US South and Global South, relatively recently put out a report focused on surveillance, US government surveillance of Black immigrant Muslim communities, and really the history of surveillance, going back to COINTELPRO, and how those pretty much similar tactics that have been perfected are being used to target communities of color and Muslim communities, especially since 9/11. So I would encourage folks to check that out. And it also talks about some tactics of resistance that communities around the country are using to fight back against the FBI and local police surveillance of our communities. And also, as I'm sure folks are aware, Israel, which is of course a settler colonial state, is the place where these tactics of surveillance and oppression are, taken to the extreme. And then they are, these technologies of oppression are then exported to various places around the world and used by repressive governments. And so here in the US, there is an untold number of localities that have this partnership with Israel, where local police is sent to Israel on an annual basis to receive training in surveillance, repression, other tactics that Israel is using on a daily basis against Palestinians, and then learning those same techniques and then bringing them back to apply against communities of color. And so a campaign that we have going in Atlanta right now is trying to end this partnership, which is called Gali. And we are looking to the model of other localities, such as the city of Durham, North Carolina, where the community there successfully pushed back and was able to end that partnership. And there have been a couple of other victories around the country. So just, something for folks to pay attention to and be aware of, as of course, we're also in solidarity with the movement for Palestinian liberation against the Israeli apartheid state. So wanted to move to the next question, which is, how is criminalization used as a tool of settler colonialism, and how does this manifest in the immigration context, also for Indigenous communities?
I can just share a bit in terms of speaking to the last question as well, is that part of my volunteer work is with the Anti-Police Terror Project in Sacramento. And so we have an MH first training, mental health first training as an alternative to policing. And so we have undergone and been witness to so much different surveillance, which has led to the criminalization within our local communities. And how is it used as a tool of settler colonialism? It's used every day. It's on a daily basis that we have, whether it's our media, our movement media partners that are being surveilled, that they are, there's it's widely known within both Sacramento and Oakland of how drones are now being used to follow and surveil our folks, whether it's through everyday actions of supporting our unhoused communities, through participating in actions at the time. And so how is that used? Is that it is used as a tool to constantly undermine us, to constantly create fear and terror within our communities. It's used as a way to, create these situations within our communities where we do not feel safe. And so we, throughout our tribal and intertribal communities, we have been offering the MH First training, knowing that we can't rely on local law enforcement and their treatment of Indigenous peoples. We can't rely on them for any sort of emergency help and support. And so providing those MH First services, providing street medic training, having it facilitated by movement nurses, is a way that we've been able to address that. And under the hashtag We Keep Us Safe, that we are creating those community alternatives to policing and also emergency responses.
Thank you so much.
This is Eve speaking. Thank you so much, Morningstar, for that. I agree with everything that Morningstar said. And also, I believe that settler colonialism works to dispossess and displace communities, and then works to, via criminalization and racialization, commodify those communities and dehumanize them. And by turning people into commodities that can be used as labor or in other exploitative practices, whether that be overseas or here in the US. And criminalization also works to serve the settler state in that in many ways now, that many people can be criminalized for simply who they are, right? That applies to Indigenous folks, that applies to Black people, applies to Latino communities, and also applies across the board in many other ways, right? As I speak from the experience of someone who works in criminalized and precarious labor, that it's not just being criminalized as a immigrant or a migrant or any of those other things. It's also that through the process of criminalization and racialization, different communities are seen as being criminal or illegal, period, on the basis of whatever work they might do. And these become justifications by the state that are used to further settler colonialism, right? And re-entrench all of these ideas again, and to continue to displace folks from their land, continue to displace folks from their communities.
Thank you so much. Anyone else want to speak to this? So what role does abolition play in resisting settler colonialism?
Hi, this is Haddy speaking. It plays a massive role, I think. I think it's this idea of reimagining and being visionary about what we want our world to look like outside of so many of the confines that settler colonialism has placed on us. And I think in order to do that, we literally need to blow all of it up, set it on fire, get rid of it, and start anew. I think, it goes into this tension between this idea of reforming and rechanging and all of that. And I think particularly in the case of the US, where every single system and mechanism to do the reforming and changing is rooted in this country's history of violence and settler colonialism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness, it becomes very, very difficult to work within those systems to make meaningful change. And I'm saying this as someone who does policy work for a living, where I, still have to balance with, working within the system that we have, but really internally understanding that the only answer to truly get to a place of freedom and autonomy is through the total abolition of these systems.
This is Eve speaking. I really want to affirm the things that Morningstar said about keeping each other safe and the sorts of tactics that they're using in their communities. And also what Haddy said about this is that abolition is not just like the removal of these systems, but also a presence, right? And in talking about criminalization, and I mentioned about how settler colonialism dispossesses and displaces communities, it means that communities are more important than ever. And abolition asks us to look into our communities and find the tactics and the strategies for which we can survive without punishing folks, without criminalizing folks, without seeing people as like dehumanizing them and criminalizing them, which is the process for which the prison industrial complex does this, right? And reinforces settler colonialism, reinforces imperialism and white supremacy. So really, I think that those are the only ways forward, and that's what abolition asks us to do.
So appreciative of both of those responses. And yes, in order to dismantle white supremacy, in order to dismantle the settler colonialism state, that we need a radical vision of abolition, that we need a radical vision that is rooted in our Indigenous values and in our Indigenous ways, that abolition is the road of decolonization, that it is the road of disrupting and dismantling all of these systems that are in place that continue to affect us and harm us on a daily basis. And I think that we need to name that, right? Like we need to name that the settler colonialism is this violence that we have continued to fight within our communities and continue to organize around in really beautiful ways. And so, yes, that's through our efforts with APTP, our efforts through MH First, that's through our Indigenous justice practices throughout Northern California, where we are figuring out and reclaiming those ways of both our ceremonial and traditional practices, along with, figuring out what, abolishing the state and taking the, prepared measures that we need to take and planning in order to do that.
Thank you so much. Before I move on to the questions addressed to individual panelists, it is time to read out the CLE code. So everybody who's attending and needs CLE credit, please listen up. The code is 3 light. So the number 3, and there's no space, light, and that's capital L, I, G, H, T. So again, the CLE code is 3 light. Thank you all. So let's move on to the questions addressed to the individual panelists. And I appreciate everyone for their contributions to the discussion so far. So questions for Catherine Perez. How has settler colonialism impacted disabled communities?
Hi, this is Catherine, and my apologies for being so silent on the first part. As I suspected, I'm learning more than I think that I can contribute in terms of my knowledge of settler colonialism, but I think it's also indicative of the work that folks in the disability rights, disability justice movement need to do in cross-coalitional work and applying, combating settler colonialism in our disability justice work. So, but from what I know about disability legal history, I would say that settler colonialism has impacted disability communities by helping to define and create disability, at least in the US. So immigration laws are historically both racist and ableist. We think back to the first laws from 1882 that included the public charge rule, which is something that creeped up and we were fighting against more recently with the Trump administration, and we're still dealing with the ramifications with during the Biden administration. And under the public charge rule, again, which is this latent immigration law in 1882, it was a way to discriminate against people who were described as unfit, degenerate, quote, lunatics, disabled folks explicitly, but also intertwined with the white heteropatriarchal justification to exclude communities of color by tying this ableism with them and under the project of eugenics, right? Which is that the white European man is superior to non-European peoples. So like I said, starting with the public charge rule in the first immigration rules, we see not only the exclusion of quote unquote disabled peoples, but we see the construction of disability. And that construction necessarily ties in people of color. And other ways that settler colonialism impacts the disability community, maybe not from a historical process, but today, we know that those who migrate here experience incredibly disabling conditions. We know that once here that our institutions continue to disable folks. We think about detention centers. There's this really great case right now, Farhite versus ICE, where we are trying to integrate disability rights laws to say that immigration detention centers are discriminatory against people with disabilities because they lack proper sanitation and other accommodations. Not that sanitation is an accommodation. I mean, it lacks basic necessities, much less provides any sort of accommodations for people who need further safeguards. Yeah, and then just some specific ways that settler colonialism impacts disabled communities, and again, I would say also constructs disabled communities. We have the example of the Dakota Access Pipeline and the contamination of water. So we have disablement of indigenous communities for the sake of capitalism and profit, and putting folks at risk for health problems and disablement. We have other types of environmental racism, exposure to pesticides by farm workers, toxic waste facilities that contribute to cancer in low-income communities of color. So I think I'll stop there, wait for my next question. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And then the next question I actually also addressed to you is, and you started addressing this, are settler colonialism and ableism at all intertwined, and if so, how?
Yeah, thank you. And first I wanted to note a little bit on language. I know a lot of folks have talked about ableism, which the most simplest definition for that is just it's discrimination in favor of quote unquote abled or non-disabled body minds. And there are folks who would rather use the term disableism, which focuses more on discrimination against disabled people. The focus away from the quote unquote abled or non-disabled body minds is, it really is derived from the medical model of disability, which sort of views disability as inherent to a person. So it's the focus on the impairment as making folks less than, and therefore disability is the lack of ability, and therefore we get terms like able-bodied, as opposed to disabled, when a lot of folks actually prefer disabled identity, and the opposite of that being non-disabled identity. But yes, like I was just saying, under settler colonialism, ableism, disableism, disablement are definitely intertwined. Just like I was saying, settler colonialism renders disability, it constructs disability, it perpetuates disability. But I also wanted to comment a little bit about settler colonialism and ableism and the intertwining of them also within our justice movements and academia and how they're intertwined. And like I was saying before, I think we have a long way to go. I think I definitely more represent, you know, the disability rights movement, trying to integrate more into the disability justice movement. I work under disability civil rights academia. I teach disability civil rights law, and all of these are structures that that posit that we need to create accommodations within the existing structures to include people with disabilities, which is sort of a band-aid solution. And whereas I think opponents of settler colonialism might challenge the existing structures completely as being disabling themselves. So like I said, as a disability rights attorney, I would argue for more accommodations in the detention setting, for example. I was just talking about Farhad case versus I think settler colonialism, like you all were just talking about again with the project of abolition would talk about dismantling all of those barriers. And just another plug too, for the disability justice movement, I always like to give props to Patty Byrne and folks from a group called Sins Invalid, and I can drop it in the chat, but they coined the disability justice movement, and they have these 10 guiding principles, and among them are rejecting white supremacy, rejecting capitalism, calling for leadership of the most impacted, cross-movement organizing and collective liberation. And the disability justice movement was really started by, like I said, these folks from Sins Invalid and other queer disabled people of color who were critiquing traditional disability rights movement organizers who tended to be more white middle class, Eurocentric. But I kind of just wanted to leave my comments here with just, I think we do have a lot of things in mutuality between folks who are fighting against settler colonialism and folks who are fighting against ableism. And I think the first thing is that both of these things create the elimination of our communities, and not that our communities are indistinct either, because of course we have Indigenous disabled communities, but just that both of our movements at least are fighting against the elimination of our existence, and that's something that we very much have in common. And another thing I think we really have in common is the fight for sovereignty and the fight for self-determination. In our disability community, we're constantly talking about self-determination or the right to make one's own life's decisions. And I think that really coincides with concept of sovereignty. And then, I'm sorry, lastly, I just wanted to say as well, the concept of interdependence is really strong within the disability rights community. And that's, again, the idea that, that we all need each other in order to survive and grow and excel. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Also, a couple questions for Morning Star. So how does the concept of citizenship interact with colonialism? And how do you, in your work, understand citizenship, community, and how those things may or may not be tied to land or a place?
Sure. First, I just want to uplift and show my appreciation to all of Catherine's comments in terms of what was shared around sovereignty and self-determination and access needs. I think that, of course, there's absolutely a lot of alignment within our communities, and addressing the ongoing rights violations within our communities and violation of our human rights, of our rights as Indigenous peoples, of our rights being violated throughout asserting our sovereignty throughout our communities. And so I just wanted to say thank you for that, and thank you to our interpreters and for the opportunity to have language justice on this panel as well. So in terms of the concept of citizenship and how that interacts with colonialism, I do feel like I answered that a bit previously, but in terms of understanding citizenship, community, and how those are tied to land and place, that they're absolutely tied in to who we are as Indigenous peoples, that my tribe spans an area of 4-county area. It's known as the 100-mile square. It's 3.5 million acres of our unceded territories and covers the county area of Shasta, Lassen, Modoc, and Siskiyou counties throughout Northern California. And as I had mentioned previously, our surrounding neighbors, our relatives of the Winnemem Wintu, of Shasta, of Modoc, of Maidu peoples are not afforded federal recognition. And I think that even the umbrella that my tribe was afforded federal recognition, it is 2 tribes, 11 bands that are culturally autonomous. And so when I was previously working for my tribe as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, I was a 1-person department that was essentially reporting to 11 of our cultural committee officers, 11 cultural committee alternates, 11 of our tribal council members, and 11 tribal council alternates. So that's 44 people that all are culturally autonomous. And so I think, I think about that and in the ways that we were afforded the recognition that it's very difficult to come to any sort of consensus. It's very difficult to come even to some sort of quorum agreement, throughout our day-to-day dealings with within tribal politics, and how it is that, tribal government structures very much model, these US government structures in that sense, and that it's not necessarily our cultural leaders and our cultural practitioners that are leading, providing that leadership in those interactions and in our consultation. And so it was just a couple of years ago that we were very active in addressing an issue in California. There was language in the Assembly Bill 52, AB 52, where they were changing the definition of a Native American tribe in California to be federally recognized only. And we really had to push back against that and say, absolutely not, when California is so unique, when we have 18 treaties that were never ratified in California due to the pressure from the US Senate and political pressure in the 1850s, in the ways that California was formed as a state and formed on the violence. And, there were bounties that were offered for our heads. There was anywhere from $1.5 to $2 million in bounties that were offered for the heads of our women and children and men back at that time. And so looking at, the issue around citizenship, it really has turned into a situation of the haves and the have-nots, right? That there's a very small number of California tribes that have been successful within their gaming operations. And so people look at California and see that, there's a small number of casinos that have been successful, but they don't see, the economic development challenges that existed, to where, they weren't worried about labor laws on reservation and rancheria lands. They weren't, we were placed on lands that, we weren't able to necessarily be able to grow crops and have, adequate farming and sustainable practices in that way. So they put us on land that there wasn't very much that we could do with. And, they were able to, and I address that because there is, this misconception and this stereotype that as California Indian peoples that we, all receive some, some sort of, whether it's, free benefits and, we're all provided with revenue sharing. And that's just really not the case. It's a very small number of tribes that have, figured out a way to be successful in that. And that does go back to, the sovereignty and self-determination of their sovereign nations in being able carry that out. And so, that doesn't go for the majority of the tribes, as I mentioned. And so I'm just thinking of, in terms of citizenship, how it is that, there are a handful of us that are considered, citizens within our tribes, and have that dual citizenship. And so we are only afforded, my children and even for myself, we have to enroll under our parents under one tribe. And because there are so many tribes throughout California that are not afforded federal recognition, they are able to participate in that way, but that, you have to choose which family and which tribe of your parents that you are going to enroll under. That, a lot of tribes at times, they don't recognize the other tribal lineage and ancestry of the other tribe. And so this has created these models where, you don't meet the blood quantum status to be able to be enrolled, and you will not be able to receive the benefits from that tribal nation. And so for my daughter, for example, her tribe on her father's side is considered disenfranchised. And so because of the political battles that were waged, and it very much was a situation where it was the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Environmental Protection Agency, where the tribe is located next to a Superfund site. The EPA came in and said, to their tribal leadership, you have to sign off. And, if we initiate this cleanup, no one in the tribe can come back and sue for the health effects. And there's been many elders in that community that have passed on due to various cancers in their body. And, there's two elders left, her grandpa and a great uncle. And so just thinking of how these, effects have very much affected the children and the grandchildren in the community that had no part in any of, what happened previously, but they are the ones that are being affected. They are the ones that do not have access to educational benefits, to healthcare benefits in those communities that have really created that devastation. And the responsibility does lie on the EPA. It does lie on the BIA, because they're the ones that said, where can we get the cheapest fill dirt for these rancheria roads and housing? And they went next door to the Superfund site and pulled the mine tailings. And that's what they lined the roads with. So there's still, a continued effort in terms of cleanup. And it very much, those are the environmental health effects. We say those are, that's the toxic legacy of the gold rush. And so that absolutely is tied into the land and the places.
Thank you very much, Morningstar. A question for Haddy. How are Black undocumented communities in the US resisting oppression, and how can others support these communities and stand in solidarity with them?
Yeah. I think how Black undocumented communities, or Black communities in general in the US are doing what we've always done and have had to quite literally to survive and exist this long. And that is to directly call out the oppression, to call out the anti-Blackness and the white supremacist motives behind so much of the state-sanctioned violence that is inflicted upon us on a day-to-day basis. And that happens whether it's through grassroots organizing and or the sort of work that I do, which is in the federal policy space. I think the onslaught of technological developments have also helped with being able to capture instances of violence. For me, it's always a very tricky topic because we shouldn't have such a high evidentiary requirement of Black suffering almost for it to matter and for our lives to matter. the things that have led to like the creation of the Black Lives Matter movement and organizations such as UndocuBlack, have been ongoing again since the inception of this country. We talk about ICE and CBP as immigration enforcement mechanisms. Those are direct derivatives of slave patrols, which were white vigilante groups that were deputized to literally hunt Black people who were trying to escape chattel slavery in this country. And so when you have, and also all police forces are derivatives of those slave patrols. The concept of policing itself in this country are derivatives of those early slave patrols. So when you look at that history, there's sort of no way of divorcing that level of just inhumanity and pure cruelty and evil and violence from the current systems at play. When we talk about lynching, for all intensive purposes, that's not that long ago. It happens every day. It just happened, was it last week or week before last in Minneapolis again? And that's just one incident again that we know of because there was video recordings of it. And so I think for Black immigrant communities in particular, it's, this continuous fight of sounding the alarm, where sometimes it's frustrating because we've been doing so and like it only seems like we get some kind of a reaction when there's like a visual next to it. But it's that dedication to continuing to fight, to continue to be seen and center our experiences and our narratives within the space of the larger immigrant justice movement, which in and of itself can sometimes be anti-Black. So not just the political systems that we're fighting against, but even, the nonprofit organizations that are oftentimes like headed or ran by, white cisgender people who, even if their intentions are well-meaning, sometimes perpetuate anti-Blackness. So calling out that sort of thing is also huge in how we're fighting against all of the various types of evils that I listed earlier.
Thank you so much, Haddy. And Yves, our question for you. So colonialism abroad tends to be connected with economic exploitation. Does the type of colonial economic exploitation also happen domestically?
Thank you for the question. I think that, of course, it does. I kind of want to contextualize this a little bit, right? So when we're talking about colonial economic exploitation that happens abroad, partially I talked a little bit about this, about how settler colonialism works to dispossess communities and displace people in order to secure land and resources, and also works to use people like commodities, right? And partially a lot to do with our work when we're talking about it is that people become displaced because of capitalism and imperialism and are pushed into precarious forms of labor because of state illegalization and social hierarchies that have to do a lot with entrenched anti-Blackness and anti-immigrant xenophobic sentiments. And so, of course, there's a lot of labor exploitation that happens here in the US, and a lot of precarious, invisibilized labor that people don't ever really get to see. So some of the settlerism and imperialism that we often see is that the US has policies via all sorts of trade deals that leads to them being able to cheaply exploit labor in other countries. But also a lot of that happens is, how do we think that someone like me ends up in the US? To acknowledge my positionality in the first place, I am a citizen, but I my family came here because of the Vietnam War. And a lot of the people who are in Red Canary Song are very recent migrants who came to the US to work and to be sex workers, to be massage workers, to be migrant workers in the first place because of this exploitation. And their labor is also being exploited here in the US. And when we're talking migrant labor, there are so many different types of labor that are largely exploited because of people's migrant status, undocumented migrant status, that can be exploited here in the US. Largely, a lot of like farming industries here in the US are run by migrant labor. Most of it has to do with cheap migrant labor from people who are criminalized, even though they help a lot of economic systems here in the US run. And from the position of someone who is a sex worker and as an organization that works to support migrant sex workers and massage workers, we believe that sex work runs the economy. Like a lot of money runs through our industries and we travel. Like the sex working industry is a history of migrant labor, of people who travel globally, transnationally across borders and support their families overseas, support their families here. And that has a lot to do with the history of imperialism here and how people even end up in the United States in the first place, not even minding the way that it displaces like Indigenous people here and what that has to do with economic exploitation as well.
Thank you so much, Yves, and all the panelists for your really significant contributions to this discussion. So we have about 15 minutes left. There is one question that I see, if anyone would like to answer that. The question is, often we speak about cross-border migration as being under threat from being policed or criminalized by or being controlled by the settler colonialist state and non-state apparatus. Does this suggest that some kinds of trans-border migration threaten or undermine the power of the settler colonialist order? And if so, how can we help it do that?
I could start. This is Eve speaking. I think the answer is of course. As I just answered in the last question, I talked about how the history of a lot of migrants and migrant labor has to do with traveling across borders transnationally, globally, and being able to work and survive and continue to do that, which tells us that our communities span borders. Also, like the borders are not real, right? These are enforced by the state, but we don't lend them legitimacy. When we try to cross these borders and like still maintain our communities, and also in acknowledging like the Indigenous tribes, which is why I brought up much earlier in this panel to talk about how often the migrants' rights movement can lead to legitimizing borders and that we should push against that, right? And that sentiment in and of itself is anti-Indigenous. So when we work to really address that and also acknowledge the ways in which like people live, the way that being a migrant, being able to live and acknowledging that like nobody gets to own this land, right? These borders aren't real. Our communities expand across these borders, whether it be like my communities overseas that are being affected by imperialism, or we're talking about Indigenous communities where when we continue to re-entrench and legitimize these borders, we're splitting up like Indigenous tribes and like their lands. And these are like not like borders exist that completely are against like where people have lived forever. And this also happens in other places as well, as like Haddy mentioned much earlier, happens in Africa. A lot of the borders that have been drawn up, those are not the tribes that existed. And so when we like acknowledge migration, when we acknowledge our communities and like look at what this dispossession does, I think that automatically pushes against this. And when we're supporting people being able to do that, and eventually, obviously the goal is to end the settler state and like not have borders exist in the first place.
Thank you so much, Yves. Any of the other panelists would like to comment on this? If the attendees have any other questions, if you all could add them to the Q&A. Okay, I see. One question was just added to the Q&A. I can pose that to the panelists. Okay. Let me see. One question actually that I could address to Morning Star. So at the end of January in California, the state, the Redwoods League, transferred ownership of over 500 acres of land to the intertribal Sinkyoni, I apologize, I'm not pronouncing that right, most likely, Wilderness Council, a group of 10 sovereign tribes who were once forcibly removed from that same land. So much land that was stolen seems like it cannot be given back in the same way, can it? What can we do with land that has been developed or land where people are unaware of the history of who lived there before they were violently removed?
Thank you. Yes, it's Sinkion, so thank you. You did have that pronunciation correct. So the Sinkion Intertribal Wilderness Council, that is an effort that I've been involved in since a small child. It has been largely led by Priscilla Hunter, who was the chairwoman for many years of the Coyote Valley Band of Pomo Indians. And so it was absolutely a huge success for them in terms of the transfer of ownership of over 500 acres of land. I think that, in terms of the question of, that land cannot be given back in the same way, and just around the land back efforts, that we need to be asking those questions of like, why can't it be returned in that way? Why can't it be returned to Indigenous ownership? And something that we are seeing that's a really big trend at this time is these white-led land trusts. And so if you are a part of a land trust that does not involve the local Native peoples of whose land that you are on, if you are a part of a land trust that may be participating in spiritual profiteering of some sort and does not acknowledge the local culture and traditions of the tribes and neighboring Indigenous peoples, then I think those are the questions that we need to be asking as well. And, in terms of people that are unaware of the history, that I think it's all of our responsibility, right? It's all of our responsibility to be aware of not only whose land that you are on, but what the local issues and local struggles are in the current reality. And so I just wanted to name that, and thank you for asking that question. I just wanted to name that because I think even we are seeing the co-option and even commodification of land acknowledgements without including the people that still continue to live and exist on them. And that is another form of erasure in terms of, separating the people from the land, and we've never been separate from it. And so I just wanted to share that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. There is one more question in the Q&A that was added. How does neo-colonialism affect communities today, globally, and in the US? Does anybody want to address that question?
I can jump in here. I think I almost don't even like the term neo-colonialism. I don't think there's anything new about it. It's almost the same frustration I have with like post-colonial, air quotes, post-colonial theory, is as if we've somehow moved past like these origins. I just think it's like this long, cruel, drawn out process, or if anything, it's the same process just being replicated by different powers that be. And I think in many ways, what we see it as now comes into form of violence through like militarized wars as well as other forms of imperialism, whether it's through like so-called business or economic styles of imperialism. From the part of the world that I come from, that's ongoing. The scramble for Africa is initially what created the first sort of set of arbitrary borders that now make the continent of Africa with all of the various different countries. And I, spoke about that earlier, about the violence that's brought out. But there is like this renewed also scramble for Africa without the same sort of powers, where it is the United States, it is China, several European countries that are, whether it's through so-called development projects that they're doing that are supposed to be so-called well-meaning, or extractive economic sort of dealings that they have. But ultimately, the people who are harmed, just like the first iteration of it, are the indigenous populations. The only people who benefit are oftentimes already wealthy people or people who are in the government. And so I think to that end, neo-colonialism, or like these newer iterations of any kind of colonialism, imperialism, continue to be harmful in the States and globally. And again, to bring it back full circle again, those sorts of practices create migrants and create asylum seekers, creates refugees, creates climate refugees in particular as well. So it's all very frustratingly interconnected.
Thank you so much, Haddy. Just, very much on point. And just to wrap up this conversation, I mean, what Haddy was mentioning in terms of the connection between US war making and forced migration, I think is really important and is not being talked about enough. The US invasion of Afghanistan, the minerals, the extraction of minerals, from Afghanistan, all the resources from Iraq, the other countries in the region that the US has attacked is not being talked about. I'm going to share a resource in the chat. It's actually an article that I wrote about sort of US war making, and why is it that we need to put an end to that, not only the overt aggression, but also the US sanctions regime that is currently impacting really an untold number of countries around the world, including Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, usually the countries that have resisted the sort of the imperialist aims of the US and allied regimes. And so I would like to thank again our panelists. It's been really an absolute pleasure to engage in this conversation with you all, and I hope that we can continue to stay involved and to learn from each other and to stand in support of our struggles. So thank you again, and thanks again to the organizers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, thank you all again. Thank you to our panelists for sharing such a powerful examples of settler colonialism, and especially for such a deep discussion on landlessness and migration. That was all really wonderful, and we all learned a lot. So this concludes day one of Resisting Settler Colonialism, and we hope that you will all join us tomorrow to hear from panelists who will be exploring what it is like to build communities beyond settler colonialism, and organizers in our own communities who are working to resist settler colonialism. The link for tomorrow's panels will be emailed to all who RSVP'd tomorrow morning. And everyone today should have received an email with a Take Action resource, which was crowdsourced from our panelists and volunteers, with dozens of ways to learn more and support and get involved in the movement. So if you're feeling inspired, which no doubt you are, I encourage you to please take a look at that. So please email us with any questions or concerns at rlsccolloquium2022@gmail.com. Thank you all and have a good night.